So it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to our first Zabriskie lecture. Our speaker this afternoon is Charles Mathewes, who's a Carolyn M. Barber Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, where he teaches religious ethics and religious thoughts. He is a prolific author, and his books have created an appropriate stir in the academy and the church. He is one of the theologians on the House of Bishops Theology Committee, along with our own Kathy Grebe. He worships at Trinity Church in Charlottesville, and a reviewer, namely me, wrote of him was reviewing his book, A Theology of Public Life, and I wrote then, "This is a remarkable book. Charles Mathewes has lived with these questions and the literature for a long time. He rarely quotes the secondary literature. Instead, we're given an extraordinary mixture of summary and judgment that is always accurate and informed. It is a marvel to read." I'm delighted he's with us today. Let's give a very warm welcome to Charles Mathewes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will not look down like this, or else I will sound like George Orwell's big brother. I have known about VTS for a long time. I have been coming to VTS now for almost 20 years. As a graduate student at Chicago, I was fortunate to have some encounters with Tim Sedgwick there and other people as well. And because of that, I was able to follow Tim's career as he moved to VTS from Seabury. And in the late 1990s, I got to know VTS pretty well, at least from an outsider's perspective. My probably most important pastor as a young man, which is now a condition, alas, in my past, was Sam Portaro, a graduate of this institution and someone who I still revere very much. It is my great fortune to have been educated by you and your colleagues in so many ways, and now it's payback time. If in the midst of my droning you begin to wonder if your butt will actually remove itself from the seats, remember that at one point people like me have been sitting in your pews as well. But actually, I know I'm here in the big leagues, and these y'all are much more worthy of speaking than I am. So let me get going so that I can do this quickly, and we can be on to questions. I did want to thank Dean Markham, Sheila Casey-Brown, and all of my many friends here, Kathy Grebe and Kate Sonderegger, many at VTS. It's been a great privilege to get to know you over the years, and I'm happy to have a chance to share some of my views. I begin, as theologians always should begin, with Scripture. In this case, the book of Hooker. Chapter 1, verse 1. One of the most beautiful theological sentences there is. "Though for no other cause, yet for this, that posterity may know we have not loosely through silence permitted things to pass away as in a dream. There shall be for men's information extant, thus much concerning the present state of the Church of God established amongst us, and their careful endeavor which would have upheld the same." I begin this way because this wonderful sentence, amidst the doing of several other things, reminds us of what theology is. Fundamentally a report, a record of what the church is, what it has done and is doing, and what those who would care about it are doing for its sustenance and advancement. It is primarily retrospective before it's prospective, and it tries to discern in human action the divine's providential governance. A report is what I aim at here, a report of where we have been, where we might be going, and what this entails. For those of us who would uphold the Church of God established amongst us, namely the Episcopal Church, our interest is especially piqued in these days. Surely we have our struggles. I will not attempt to sketch them here. I'm sure you can do that during the coffee hour. I'm sure we do very little else but sketch them in the coffee hour. I do note that the most recent public struggle in our church, the rather disquieting chaos that has befallen General Theological Seminary, encapsulates much of our problems and cannot be far from our minds and our thoughts today. As a citizen of another republic of learning that suffered some similar and equally unwelcome tumult several years ago, when the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors decided on a weekend to fire our president, only 3 weeks later to rehire her, I can only say, and I hope I say for you as well, that my thoughts and my prayers are with all those who are caught up in that conflagration. Today I want to suggest that what we need in the Episcopal Church and in the broader American churches today is a revived social gospel, both because that is true to the church's vocation and because such a gospel will help us see how the church can live in this age without becoming, in Martin Luther King's rather painfully accurate words, an irrelevant social club devoid of faith or prophetic fervor. King's words strike deep for me because it seems that the church has not been doing a good job of placing itself in contradiction to the broader pathological social patterns in which we live, move, and all too often have our being. And speaking a better word, another way, instead of them. I say this not in anger, but in anxiety, in concern, and in the hope that when we are recalled to our calling, we may renew ourselves yet again, or may be renewed yet again. I also say this not as a call for churches or preachers to be more strident, but rather to be more subtle and cunning, like the serpent, in pursuing this other way. In my view, the church has as its first mission discipleship, the upbuilding and discipleship of its members and the invitation to our neighbors to share the good news of discipleship. It does this in various ways, at best, but it has to give at least witness of its own purpose as a school of charity, a hospital of grace, not only with its lips, but in its life. But the church will be stymied in this unless it names and addresses those patterns in our lives that resist and hinder that discipleship. The churches today, it seems to me, find themselves in a social order where certain social and political pathologies are so vivid as to render certain dimensions of the gospel very hard to preach in sincerity and very hard to indeed to apprehend and be informed by in the proper sense. That is, our social and political condition is, strictly speaking, deeply unchristian. And we need to confront it, not first and foremost for political or immediate immanent reasons, but for reasons of Christian discipleship and pedagogy. We need a renewed social gospel, that is, for the sake of Christian souls. Think back with me to 100 years ago. Several notable events happened in 1914. One you might not think about was the publication of Walter Rauschenbusch's small book entitled Dare We Be Christian? You can look it up on Google Books, right? It's actually vividly accessible now online. It's a nice, popular summary of his overall position. Jesus embodied love. Paul preached love. We need a modern supplement to Paul's preaching, but the supplement will simply be an extension of the gospel of love and fellow feeling in modern society's larger and less organically related structures. Rauschenbusch's program was a poignant and heartfelt proposal, and it fell flat on its face and was seemingly soon forgotten. It failed for many reasons. First of all, it failed because of history, exemplified by the apocalyptic conflagration of what we now call the First World War. Sometimes we don't ponder the ironies of that title enough. We typically don't appreciate what a radical change that war meant for the Christian world, but consider two facts. At the end of that war, political entities that had been effectively continuous with the Roman Empire, namely the Ottoman Empire through the Byzantines and the Russian Empire through the Tsar, had ended. Right? And by 100 years ago today, October 7th, 1914, more people had been killed and wounded in the combat in Europe in the previous 2 months than had been casualties for the entire century before that. And the war would last 25 times as long as it has so far endured and cost upwards of 30 times the lives already spent. Part of the problem with Rauschenbusch's formulation was that the optimism of control and agency died, as it were, on the Somme. Other events soon after, such as the Great Depression and the persistence of racial and national hatred emerging most definitely in Nazism, seemed also to speak against the social gospel. Perhaps the particular configuration of our social injustices could be modified, minorly ameliorated, but perhaps the deeper, darker energies that drive group exclusion and competition were, in fact, natural and inescapable for humanity. There were a second set of reasons, more theological, famously formulated by Reinhold Niebuhr, about the internal limitations of this view, that it purchased social insight and mobilized social energy at the cost of sacrificing a properly theological analysis of sin and grace. Niebuhr's Christian realist critique came to be heard as devastating and unanswerable. And while many later criticized Niebuhr himself, either for not being sufficiently politically radical, the critique launched by liberationists, or for not being sufficiently theological, the critique launched by figures like Stanley Hauerwas, the social gospel itself has never really been resurrected. Today it seems as quaint as sock hops, bell-bottoms, pet rocks. And so the social gospel, which actually signaled a massive shift in theological attitudes, became known as a brief, enthusiastic, but mildly embarrassing episode on the way to a more mature, sober faith. But we critique that thing most vehemently that is most proximate to us. And while all these criticisms have force, they are not radical rejections of the social gospel, but rather, as many have pointed out, friendly emendations to it. They share a recognition that individualism is insufficient, that the social order is contingent and demands critical intelligence, and that the churches themselves need to provide that intelligence on their own terms, not wait upon secular thought forms to provide it for them. That is the core, as I take it, of what Rauschenbusch and other figures of his time, Catholic social teachings as this, figures in the British Christian socialist movement do this, figures like Karl Barth and Goldwitzer and others do this in Germany and Switzerland. All of these figures had this common association of these three core ideas, right? First, the idea is that the social is a distinct site and topic of theological reflection. Most earlier forms of Christianity, the accusation went, targeted only part of the object that contemporary Christian thought needed to engage. Christianity should concern itself not simply with inner individual lives, but with the entire social order in which those lives are lived out. Second, and entailed in the first, the social gospel insisted on the contingency of the social realm, the way that the social order is something we collectively make, not a God-given reality, nor a natural reality. If we have a situation in which we have large-scale child labor, that's because we've decided to have that. Chattel slavery, that's our decision. It's not God's. And if we want to, we can change that. Even in a culture so expressly anchored in revolution as the United States, the tendency to naturalize contingent social orders, such as the divisions and hierarchies of class, leisured rich and working poor, structured American society in powerful ways. Rauschenbusch's argument that society is in crisis was a recognition that industrialization was changing America beyond all imagining of the past, and the churches needed to catch up with the realities they were speaking of. Third and finally, and in a way most apologetically, the social gospel insisted that mere secular reason was not enough, that there would need to be an explicitly theological moment in the analysis of our situation and a theological component for any adequate proposed response to it. Niebuhr complained about Rauschenbusch's analysis here. Right? Niebuhr said, the idea that the kingdom is at hand, is present, is viable, and is a durable, reliable force, presence, a reality in our world, and is going to grow over time. This is crazy, Niebuhr says. And also, Rauschenbusch's proposal that the law of love could be simply applied to our world. This is crazy too. But Niebuhr did not deny. In fact, his entire career was built on the idea that in offering this kind of theological insight to society as a whole, the Christian church is doing something very important that cannot be handed over to a university or a king or a president. If the first point above was an intra-theological debate about the propriety of this kind of analysis as a form of theology, this last moment is a debate in public discourse about the propriety of this kind of theology as a kind of analysis, a contribution to a larger public conversation. In the burgeoning discussions of the social that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when the discipline of sociology emerged, the disciplines, the practices of social science, of social welfare, all these things start appearing. Right? It would have been very, very easy for religious voices not to play an explicit role. And it is almost entirely due to the social gospel that we now have a self-consciously Christian form of public witness. In short, we can say the social gospel was the form that Christian reflection on this worldly life should take after the collapse of Christendom in two senses. First, it is the form that Christian reflection on this worldly life takes after the denaturalization and de-divinization of the social order, the recognition that our social structures are up to us and that we are obliged to consider if we accept them. Second, it is a form of theology developed in response to the Church's declaration of independence, as it were, from the political authorities of the nation-state, not just in their structural disestablishment, but in the sense that those authorities needed to be contested, not just over the topics that they might from time to time claim illegitimately as their own concern, church worship or things like that, but even over the topics to which those authorities had legitimate rights, like labor law, war, industrial policy. Seen in this light, figures like Reinhold Niebuhr, Stanley Hauerwas, Emily Towns, James Cone, and Walter Rauschenbusch all share far more with each other on all these matters than they do with any theologian between their age and that of John Calvin. And behind Calvin, it's hard to think of others. In these lectures, then, I want to carry this tradition forward in our context. For over the past century, the social gospel has been simultaneously, has accomplished much and been almost entirely forgotten. In this, I'm broadly in agreement with David Hollinger, an historian in California, who has given an account of the kenotic travails of what he calls ecumenical Protestantism in the 20th century. If I do nothing else for you today and tomorrow, I at least give you this phrase: jettison the idea of the main line. The main line is an unhelpful description of a majority position. Hollinger actually thinks that what's been going on in the 20th century is a movement of what he calls ecumenical Protestantism, a form of Protestantism which is broadly, essentially open to other forms of thought and other forms of believing. Without giving itself up, it reaches out to those. It is ecumenical Protestantism that has been mobilized throughout this past century, on Hollinger's reading, in enormously powerful and socially contributory ways. He thinks, in fact, and he's a secularized Jewish guy, right? But he thinks, in fact, that this movement has contributed to a substantial Christianization of the social order in some ways. By welcoming greater participation of all sorts of people in the American experiment, in particular women, Jews, and African Americans, by working to create a more humane environment for workers, the aged, and children in our society, and even by working to keep America, after World War II, involved in the rest of the world. But Hollinger argues ecumenical Protestantism did this, gained so much of the world, but lost a lot of its soul in the meantime. Today, he argues, the moral energies that these churches had a hand in unleashing are independent of the churches themselves, while the churches stagger on, husks of their old crusading realities. Now, I think he overstates the defeat of the churches, obviously. So I will ask the next question. If that narrative, absent that kind of final moment, is largely right, what can we learn from it? I believe the churches need to figure out how to fulfill their basic vocation, discipleship and evangelization, in this profound way, in light of Hollinger's worry, which is also Reinhold Niebuhr's critique of Walter Rauschenbusch and Stanley Hauerwas's critique of Reinhold Niebuhr. Right? For while the past century has been helpful in thinking about the church's vocation of social concern, it has come at some cost to that more fundamental vocation of training its members to become fit for the weight of glory that is our eschatological destiny as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. How can the social gospel be a part of this broader Christian pedagogy of discipleship? A renewed social gospel will speak of matters traditionally of concern in this way, but seek to find out how to understand those concerns, more thoroughly rooted in the church's vocational context of spiritual pedagogy. At the core of this social gospel, then, the churches should teach parishioners to see the world, see the social world aright, to give them a good sociological imagination, as part of our spiritual pedagogy. Then the churches must teach us to respond appropriately with action in properly perceived situations, to care about the social order, both in itself, in its current situation, as its current situation may be so scandalous as to make our efforts at proper worship of God hypocritical and offensive to the Lord. And they ought to care about the social order as a foreshadowing of the kingdom, a potential icon, if you will, of the world that is to come. There's a deep theological argument to be had here, but I don't want to have it, at least right now, about the nature of this worldly activity and eschatological promise in Christianity. If you want to, we could talk about that afterwards with like a glass of wine in my hand. I hope to show you that a social gospel so preached would have diagnostic bite, prescriptive promise, and a pedagogical and disciplining power in our churches today, not to mention being a word badly needed in our societies as a whole. Now, what social crises confront us today that we can talk about? I want to talk about two dimensions of the social order in these lectures that can well serve us as prompts for this rejuvenated approach to the social gospel. Both have been massive, though still deeply underappreciated changes in our social order, especially in the United States. So in talking about them at all, I think is actually a step in the right direction on its own. Both have larger implications for the health of our social order that we would do well to acknowledge and consider. But most importantly for my purposes, most immediately I should say, maybe not importantly, both have been significant problems for the church's primary vocation in ways that the churches have not fully recognized. And I mean here the twin crises of rising and apparently perduring economic inequality and the rise over the past 40 years of what some people are calling a carceral state with our criminal justice system. The first, as I will argue today, encourages us to doubt the reality of the possibility of a common good. The second encourages us to doubt the possibility of any kind of this worldly justice. And both, in an American context, are deeply implicated in what some people, in some ways me among them, consider America's uniquely original sin, that of racism and chattel slavery. Were the churches to take on these challenges, they would lead their congregants on a harrowing journey through the valley of the shadow of death, to hear God's judgment in a new and potentially terrifying way, making them able, though, through that, also to receive God's liberating forgiveness in an equally more powerful manner. To confront these facts about us would make our religion something other than the irrelevant social club that King worries it might be. It would make it dangerous for us and threatening. It might even give the Spirit a wider field on which to play. I start in this lecture with the scandal of inequality. We know in general terms of the crisis in U.S. society over the past decade. We know that wages have, by and large, stagnated. What's worse, though, the 2008 crash destroyed a lot of the false wealth that had appeared over the previous few years in the form of inflated home prices, right? So there's a case to be made that the United States now is the most economically inegalitarian it has been in a long while, and that this inegalitarianism, this inequality, has as one of its most pernicious aspects the rise of an almost permanent underclass which has been set adrift from the commonweal. To show what I mean, I want to look at 4 kinds of evidence, right? Very quickly, just lay these out for you because you've read about them probably in various newspapers, but you've probably never put them all together in this unless you've read some of the same books that I have, which God help you if you have. And it's worth considering as an ensemble. First, stagnation. The median annual income for a male full-time year-round worker in 2013 was $51,939 in 2013 dollars. The median annual income for a male full-time year-round worker in 1973, that is 40 years ago, was $52,500 in 2013 dollars. Yes, that's right. Working class men in 2013 actually made less than working class men 40 years ago. And all of this has happened in an age when worker productivity has more than doubled since the late 1970s. That is, employers are now getting twice the productivity at effectively the same cost. That's a deal, right? This isn't totally catastrophic for our economy, mostly because women have entered the workforce at very high levels, right? Which is why we have a lot of social, and one of the reasons why you have a lot of social tension around marriage, right? Especially with young children. It's hard if you have two people working. Right? But larger patterns reflect similar trends. In fact, all things considered, median household income hit a peak in 1999 of $56,893 and has declined ever since. It's as if you worked hard for a decade and a half and were actually making less at the end of it. When economists talk about a lost decade, that's what they mean. Second, consider mobility, the possibility that people can move out of their wealth bracket. The consequences in the last 40 years of this have been substantial as well. Americans like to believe that what we lack in European-style Social Security, we make up for in American-style social mobility. Well, despite what you might hear on some TV stations, that's just not true anymore. America has less social mobility than many European nations, including the United Kingdom and Denmark. The income hierarchy in America, as economists say, is pretty sticky. That in itself is not a very large change from previous generations. In fact, it's always been reasonably hard for the very poor to become even moderately rich. But what has changed is the importance of that mobility. Many thinkers, like Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson in their book Winner Take All Politics, Timothy Noah in his book The Great Divergence, argue that the U.S. has experienced a substantial increase in income inequality at the same time that the stagnation has happened. So the lack of churn between social levels, economic levels, is combined with a rocketing upwards of the top income levels. Furthermore, because of tax reform since the 1980s, this inequality is ever more durably cross-generational, so that the super rich are now more likely than ever to be the heirs of those who built up that pile of money on which they perch. The birth lottery matters more than ever in the United States. The rhetoric we heard in the 2012 election of the makers and the takers turns out to be a little ironic here. The makers are not often themselves actually makers, if there ever were such Atlas-like heroes, but the children or grandchildren of the putative makers. Now, the poor we will always have with us, but they don't have to be the same poor generation after generation. We may not be able to remove the fact that some people get fabulously wealthy and some end up immiserated. Some of us are dumber than others of us. Some of us are luckier than others of us. Sometimes these facts about us end up putting some of us with more money than others of us. That's all fine. But the consequences of our deeds, our dumb luck, our stupidity, should not enchain future generations. To secure that, we need a fairly high rate of churn across economic boundaries, and that's precisely what we don't have today. Third, while people's hopes of rising through the economic classes have plummeted, the fear of falling ever further behind has risen. Objective measures of instability have increased, while long-term employment for both blue-collar and white-collar workers has declined, and with a continuous cultural and legal pressure to reconceive everybody as an independent individual contractor. Furthermore, the decline of manufacturing in America, which has encouraged just the sorts of jobs conducive to long-term stability, led to further difficulties in securing stable employment. In such a short-term, winner-take-all economy as we have today, appeals to a long-term common good can come to seem unrealistic, even for an audience irrational. And fourth and finally, overall stratification. From the 1940s to the early 1970s, stratification in the United States decreased. That is, the very wealthy and the very poor got closer to each other. But in the late 1970s, the gap between rich and poor began to widen again and has accelerated ever since. In 1945, the total income share of the top 10% of the working population was approximately 1/3 of the nation's total income. By 2008, it was approximately 1/2. Since the recession, it has only gotten worse. One consequence of this is that the middle class has been shrinking for some time. In 1970, slightly more than 50% of all households fell within 50% of the national median income. Last year, 42% of all households fell in that middle band. That's a 20% decrease. Another consequence is that the rich and the poor are drifting ever farther apart in other ways as well. This stratification, this divergence, is actually relatively unusual in America in this way. Whereas most forms of difference are becoming forms which we are seeing increasingly intimately related, right? We are growing, that is, very much more familiar with people of different races. We have cross-gender friendships. We know and are comfortable with people of different sexual orientations. Religious diversity is something that is very common in families, right? All these things. We are growing less familiar than we have been in the past with people in significantly different economic conditions than ourselves. As we accept all sorts of diversity, except economic, this gets worse and worse. If you doubt me, compare the people you find in a checkout line at Whole Foods to the people waiting at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Only our political alienation from one another is increasing at anything like this rate. You'll notice that I haven't even talked about the character of poverty in our age. That would be another talk altogether. But there are some important facts to keep in mind about how poverty has been changing in the past few decades. Overall, median, well, no, I don't want to say that. Poverty remains very heavily racialized. African American and Hispanic Americans have poverty rates at something like 3 or 4 times what whites have. And the most common people who are in poverty are children. Right? 16.4 million children are in the poor and the poorest of the poor in 2011. Also rising is a thing called concentrated poverty, neighborhoods where at least 40% of the people live below the poverty line. This has increased in the past decade after declining in the 1990s. Right? Now, interestingly, when you think about concentrated poverty, you are likely to think about African American slums or something like that. But the actual fact is concentrated poverty is significantly a white rural phenomenon. Right? Fascinating thought. Right? And I want to come back to this conception of what we perceive our social problems being and what actually they are. Okay? The number of Americans in deep poverty, right, in 2011 stood at 20.5 million, about 6.7% of the population. That's up almost 50% from 2000. Now, this is not a matter of inexorable natural forces, but of contingent political decisions that we took in the 1990s. In the 2.5 decades since 1990, cash aid, the giving of a welfare check, dropped precipitously in America. The rolls of poor people receiving such support in many states dropped by 90%. The 1996 welfare reform law, which many people still argue, and I think for very plausible reasons, did many good things, I'm not arguing that, imposed stringent requirements upon adults, mostly single mothers, who received that aid, forcing them to be either working or actively looking for work. Furthermore, in the last 2 decades, the nature of governmental aid to the poor has shifted. In 1984, federal aid to poor families was broadly progressive, meaning that the poorest families, the deep poor, got the most help. Over the next 2 decades, the aid became what economists call paternalistic. That is, it shifted its center of gravity away from the deeply immiserated towards the elderly and those with special needs, while the deeply impoverished got less and less. Families in deep poverty received 38% less aid over this period, while aid to families in shallow poverty rose by 86%. At least since 2004, as a polity, we have been helping families in shallow poverty much more than we have been helping families in deep poverty, more to those in paid employment than to those not working, and more to 2-parent families than to single-parent ones. Get to work, we say. But that's no solution because, as I said above, wages have stagnated for 3 or 4 decades, and the most impoverished have little access to the education and training that would allow them to build a career. All these social policy changes occurred in a time of economic growth, mind you. The 1990s were a very big boom. Right? But when the economic tide recedes, as it inevitably does, then you see what the effects are of policies like this. And the effects are dire. If you're a single mom who wants to stay at home with your kids rather than work the night shift at Walmart, you and your children are getting shafted. And because there are 7 million American children whose families earn below 50% of the poverty line today, and those children we know suffer most profoundly the effects of this deep poverty, the direct effects of policy decisions that we took in the 1990s will echo with us the direct effects until almost the 22nd century. This kind of poverty is a scandal to the well-formed Christian conscience. It should be, in a rich society like ours, a scandal to everybody. And this is important, obviously, in itself. Poverty of this sort is intrinsically bad, leading to horrible outcomes for people in health, education, overall participation in society. Right? It is especially bad for our kind of social order, right, in which many more social goods, relatively speaking, are monetized. You need a car to get places, right? You need a car to find work often in our system. If you don't have a car, you're not going to be able to get work. But I don't mean to focus simply on the secular consequences and concerns here. I want to ask about how living amidst these realities and ignoring them will harm or is harming the churches as well. For these realities feed the worst parts of ourselves and contribute both to a deep deformation of our character, right, and a crippling of the church's witness to serve all of the community. First of all, our failure simply to recognize what has happened leads us into a blindness about our culture that is itself morally culpable. For by and large, Americans simply do not see the fact of this rising unequal society all around us. And this is a confessional moment for me. This is about what and I'm inviting you to think if you see this or not. Some of us have, unfortunately, much more proximate vision to this than others of us. I am a relatively inoculated guy from this, and so reading this stuff in the last 4 or 5 years has been for me a very sobering experience. Indeed, Americans continue to think that we live in an egalitarian culture. A recent study showed that Americans are far more likely than Europeans to believe that they live in a middle-class society, even though income is really much less equally distributed here than it is in Europe, where, in contrast, the people think they're getting rogered by the upper classes, but in fact they're not. When Americans are asked what an ideal wealth distribution would be, they prefer one that they think is quite proximate to their own, and actually turns out to be the distribution of Sweden. We do not recognize the world in which we live. In this, believers are no different from anyone else. Second, even as we fail to acknowledge to ourselves what our world is truly like, we have begun to feel it in our bones. For living in this context encourages everybody to cultivate a zero-sum, winner-takes-all mentality. The experience of knowing the possibility of paralyzing poverty and of hearing rumors of rising inequality damages the social compact by communicating a powerful message to all members of society that we need and care for each other in the ways necessary both to help so many get out of poverty and simply to see one another as colleagues in a common struggle, the struggle to become a true community. If in fact there is no reliable safety net, and if in fact the social conditions are such that those who are not at the top are those who are left behind, even unto their children's children, well, in this case, an attitude of, I've got to look out for myself develops. An Ayn Randian ethos of selfishness looks increasingly attractive. And so the social order itself reinforces some pretty universally powerful tendencies towards self-centeredness and an apparently necessary indifference towards others. Thus it is that the idea of generosity, of mercy, of grace becomes a sucker's bet. And I would propose to you that the emergence in public discourse of a broad-based libertarianism in the last couple decades is not only due to the fact that very wealthy bankers are sponsoring this, but also due to the fact that they have a receptive audience who have experienced themselves on the outs from institutions that they thought had their back. Third, and as the flip side of this zero-sum mentality, living in this condition encourages us to be blind to how we do already benefit from the labor of others, and thus how we ourselves are always already in a position of indebtedness to others. The fact is, not even the richest of Americans can rely on themselves or those that they directly pay to live as they do. We all need roads, a postal network, a phone system, police, firefighters, snowplows, and a million relatively invisible structural realities that we do not ourselves create for ourselves. There is a Pelagian and Pharisaical strain of works righteousness in a lot of our political speech these days. The blindness of people, especially rich people, but everybody, to the ways that they depend on other people is, of course, a notorious fact. There are, in fact, no self-made men, because everyone depends on the social infrastructure that we all collectively pay for and collectively sustain, or not. The wonderful moment when the senator from Arizona at a health policy, at a panel on health insurance, a very conservative senator from Arizona said, well, I don't see why I should have to pay for OBGYN care. I'm a man, I don't have this. And a female senator from, it wasn't North Carolina, but it was someone very politely said, well, perhaps your mother required it, Senator. It was a lovely moment, right, to me. He just laughed nervously. But much of the rhetoric that legitimates inequality, we can call it the theodicy of social good luck, appeals to a patina of libertarian justice. As Reinhold Niebuhr put it, since inequalities of privilege are greater than could possibly be defended rationally, the intelligence of privileged groups is usually applied to the task of inventing specious proofs for the theory that universal values spring from and that general interests are served by the special privileges which they hold. That defines a lot of the ideology that my colleagues and I encounter at the University of Virginia among our students, where the average income of the parents is well in excess of $100,000. Right? The University of Virginia is a public institution, I'll remind you. There are years when we don't admit people from entire counties in the state of Virginia. Right? Those would be poor coal counties. There aren't that many counties in Virginia, by the way. Not that I'm bitter about this. Consider the invisibility of government support. Remember during the Obamacare stuff, there was this great moment where someone said, keep your government hands off my Medicaid. Right? Here's a more, the plural of anecdote is not data, but here's a more data-rich example of that. 53% of student loan recipients, 44% of Social Security recipients, and 40% of Medicare recipients believe that they have never used a government social program. A dangerous level of self-ignorance develops, which works as an acid to quickly eat away at our capacity for recognizing what we owe to each other and for gratitude and our concomitant ability to care for one another. Thus it is that in the recent recession, even as those earning less than $100,000 on average, this came out in a report yesterday on the Chronicle of Philanthropy's website, even as those earning less than $100,000 increased their charitable giving by 5% over the course of the recession, those who earned more than $200,000 in our economy declined their giving by 5% as well in the same time. Those who earned between $100,000 and $200,000 lowered their level by 3%, so they're not much better. The pressures on individuals towards living in a zero-sum environment, pressures to deform their self-knowledge and refuse to recognize their involvement with their neighbor, encourages especially white Americans toward a deeper entrenchment in racist attitudes that still so deeply mark our society and divide us from one another in pointless ways. In tough times, it has long been recognized societies are more likely to resegregate into smaller subgroups. This is a fact of human nature, at least east of Eden. But it's also the case that our more proximate political decisions can exacerbate or diminish that tendency. And so we must ask, given the manifest value to society as a whole, and to each of us as members of that society, of efforts at enabling greater social churn and economic uplift, why are we so hostile as a nation to social programs? What is it that differentiates us from so many European countries in this way? Part of the story is surely a legacy of skepticism about government and suspicion of political authority, which has earned America a valued place in the history of places of civic republicanism. Okay? I'm not saying this is entirely bad. But part of it is a consequence of the association of welfare programs with race, a force at least equally as powerful in US history as civic republicanism. To be frank, Americans believe that welfare is not an American thing, but a black thing. And this association seems to have developed very vigorously since the 1970s as part of an intentional plan by some political forces to delegitimate the welfare system as a whole. Right? But like a sorcerer's apprentice, in doing this, they not only delegitimated the welfare system, they further re-entrenched the racism that always lurks at or near the surface of American society. Government benefits have been racialized in the sense that white people see government support to be disproportionately directed to minority groups, and especially African Americans, right? From Reagan's welfare queen to the Obama phone scam to Mitt Romney's discussion of the 47%. But of course, the irony here is that the majority of people supported by this are poor rural whites. And well-off white people manage to believe that the social benefits they receive are ones that they have pure and simply earned. For those who rely on the government do not look like them. In all these ways, living in an increasingly unequal society is not just bad for its increasing inequality and cruelty to poor people, right? But even in a very, very narrow way, morally for the people in our churches. It makes us smaller, meaner people. It encourages selfishness, narcissism, suspicion, hostility, and racial animus. And it discourages generosity, vulnerability, openness, and care for neighbors. It also works towards the subtle undermining, and this is my final substantial point, a subtle undermining of the idea of a common good, a good in common that we cannot know alone, not just politically and morally, but even spiritually and theologically. This is a challenge, that is, especially facing any church that has and seeks to inculcate in its members a richly sacramental vision of creation. One that sees the world as charged with the grandeur and glory of God, provoking in us wondrous gratitude. One that hears the world groaning in the labor pains of bearing a new world of redemption, inducing in us a joyful eagerness to seek that kingdom. A sacramental vision that dares to dream a new and wondrous world is already coming into being in our midst. Cultivating this sacramental imagination is a struggle in the best of times. You know that better than I do. Today, it cannot be done without confronting the powers and principalities that infect our world. And that's all for today. Thank you. How long was that?
Oh, good. Less than 50. Stay there. Don't go anywhere. Do feel free to come in and find a seat, those who are standing. We've got some time for questions. We go through to 3:30, and the time now is 2:53. Let me just start the ball rolling, and then we have mics, I think, hovering around. Thank you, one either side, and I'll catch your eye, and then we'll bring you in. First of all, I want to call you Chuck. Am I allowed to call you Chuck? Yeah. Thank you. I'll call you Chuck if I may.
That's one of the more polite things people call me.
Thank you very much. That was a fabulous presentation, and let me just make sure I understand it. You know, the social gospel had something right, and that was it was an opportunity to comment on our social order, taking theology seriously. The social gospel succeeded, and I quite like your suggestion that instead of the main line, we now call ourselves ecumenical Protestantism, and we succeeded in opening up our social discourse and social order, especially to women and African Americans. And then you invited, and you had that lovely phrase, you want to invite us to a renewed social gospel and take our congregation, so this is what you said, I made a note of it, on a harrowing journey. Okay, on a harrowing journey. All right. So then you decided...
Put that in your church bulletin board.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see this doing great for church growth. Okay, then you said... Thank you very much, yes. Then you said, as my first illustration, let's look at economic inequality, and then you did a very masterful survey of the racial dimension, the many layers of it, and for a renewed need of the common good. Okay, so let me start the ball rolling with a simple question, and that is, okay, we've got a lot of clergy in this room. They go off and they take their congregation on a harrowing journey. And one of the major pledges, or perhaps the three major pledges, sit their rector down and say, look, thank you for this harrowing journey. We're not enjoying it. So the serious question underpinning all this is this really saying if you want to be a Christian or parishioner, you need to be a Democrat? And is this really saying...
No.
Is this really saying that week in, week out, we need to make anybody who's blessed with any resources on which the operating budget of the congregation depends feel really uncomfortable?
Good.
That's
good.
my opening question, sir.
Should
You
I
now have the
stand
podium.
here? That's great. That's great.
back.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about this, I've been surprised as this lecture has worked itself out at how, frankly, partisan it became. I needed to follow the argument out myself to where it went. But I was surprised in the end that I had to say the stuff I said about where some of, especially the racial animus stuff, comes out. We all know members of multiple political parties, and we have all known people who are deeply, deeply committed to the common good in very different political views. And we have all known, jeepers, I'm from Virginia. I mean, the Democrats are not in any way angels on race, right? There is a curious fact about a certain faction of the Republican Party right now that has gained the ascendancy that I worry about, but I can't claim any expertise on that. I'm weaker than your typical newspaper op-ed on this, right? I have no real standing. I do know there are lots of Republicans who are troubled by the thought. This is the George H.W. Bush Republicans, possibly the early George W. Bush Republicans, who were troubled by the thought that Republicanism has effectively become a political party of angry white people, angry older white people. Angry white men. Many, yes. Yes. They're my people, right? Why? I want to be with them. And I don't mean that, though. I know one of the things I didn't say is that one of my secular worries about the United States' current condition is that actually, this is kind of vaguely Republican thought, this weakens the nation geopolitically, and in my kind of cold-blooded Niebuhrianism, I really want America to be relatively strong for the foreseeable future because absent America, I don't think there's a good international order out there. Like, what do you want? You want Putin? You want China? Come on. So I don't mean to be making it too partisan. I do think that there are very good Republicans who would agree that there's been a kind of devil's bargain made with a certain unfortunate element of America in that. On the wealth issue, I think that people want to come to church because they want their lives to have meaning and to matter. And I think that there is a very, very healthy, and I mean, again, this is where I'm a centrist, a very, very healthy and sane gospel of the legitimacy of wealth under certain construals and stuff like that. What I worry about is the person who comes to the pastor at the end of the sermon and says, you keep talking about how I have to be grateful to other people, but I was born very poor, and I have worked every day of my life very, very hard, and I don't owe anybody anything. And that strikes me as, and again, I'm not a pastor, but that strikes me as a pastoral problem. How do you confront someone who genuinely has a vision of themselves, which is pretty damn authentic, but also, it seems, to my mind anyway, maybe not to yours, is maybe closing that person off from some recognition of their relationship to other people. So that would be my thing there. The harrowing journey thing, I mean, we putatively worship, there's often a cross. And I talked to my kids in classes today that if Christianity were founded today, we'd all be walking around with little necklaces with electric chairs on them. And to think about that is not as a political statement per se, but just as a thought that there's a very gruesome destiny that's part of the gospel, and ought to be recognized, I think. But that's why I'm not a priest. I'm not a...
Okay, questions, please. At the back, sir. Wait for the mic, can you, because it's being recorded and webcast.
Class of 1964. Given the rugged individualism of Ayn Rand philosophy, which is so redolent throughout our politics and even, I guess, in our religious perspective, what makes you think that social gospel has any legs to stand on, much less run?
I think the only evidence I have is that there are these situations that you can put people in where they do recognize, it seems to me, their mutual relationship to each other. The ideology is very powerful and is strenuously communicated to people. But even in those situations, what you see is that you have to spend a lot of money and have a lot of think tanks to get even a significant number of people, not a majority, but just a substantial number of people, pretty convinced that this works out. In other words, you have to use a lot of energy to make people believe in libertarianism. And I think that actually, if we were to begin to explicitly resist it, if once a year, every minister in this room preached a sermon about Ayn Rand, that might be interesting. And you know, you might get some pushback from congregation. There are people out there. There are people who are preaching a kind of Christian libertarianism in a interesting way. Just think about that too.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please. And then we'll go to the back. Wait for the mic again.
Fred Clark's in the class of 2008. What are some idols that need to kind of be confronted that are causing this situation currently?
One of the idols, the one we've been talking about the most, is this notion of individual achievement and accomplishment. As professors, I and my colleagues have a pastoral responsibility about this. It seems to me a good sign that lots of young people, I mean, of course, they're the ones who come to a religious studies professor's office are already pre-selected in some very twisted ways. But a lot of young people actually care very deeply about volunteering and seem to be committed to ethical action of various sorts. So I think that's a good thing. And the worry I have is that much of that tends to, it can become easily conflated as a kind of form of CV buffing up. You can boost your resume in a certain way, right? And so there is, especially in the higher reaches of our culture, a kind of gospel of success. And also, I would invite all of you, if you deal with young, successful kids, not just white kids, primarily white kids, but not just white kids, young, successful kids, to read an older piece by David Brooks. It was from the Atlantic in 2000, called The Organization Kid. You can Google it, it's online. And The Organization Kid is a terrific study of how thoroughly scripted students are all the way through school and into college. I joke with my undergrads that even their orgies are scripted. And in fact, I suspect some people join fraternities and sororities mostly to be able to put on their CVs, I organized 8 orgies in the course of the year, collaborated with different interest groups, yada, yada, yada. And we donated all the profits to charity or something like that. Because even their sins get instrumentalized into this larger gospel of success, kind of radical scriptedness. So that would be another thing I would say, the scriptedness, which is also about a fear of failure, right? I mean, Jesus said the way is narrow, but Jesus didn't know about the way of the economic path of American success today. You talk to a 21-year-old kid in college, and they know the way is narrow. They just don't know which way it is.
Julius Jackson, class of 90. I do believe, first of all, I thank you. I was looking forward to hearing you because the church is about social gospel. But the problem, I do believe, is too much freedom in the culture we live. Somebody said, you should talk about Iran. In the United States, I think it is Christians fighting against Christians. We don't have anybody else who really help us to know who we are. I grew up in a culture where 85% of the people were Muslims. And I had to find my identity. And it is because of the church. And you know, we take so much for granted. Even church folks say we are not a social institution when you have a soup kitchen, when you visit a prison. I say, what happened to Matthew 25? You know? So I do believe the question for me is, how could we go back to our roots? So we realize that feeding the poor or visiting the prison, we're all in that group.
I like that very much. I wish we had a richer and more serious practice of actually reaching out to groups that were not maybe going to show up at our doorsteps if we could. I'm speaking about incarceration tomorrow, and some of the stuff there is even more bone-chilling, blood-curdling than the stuff about poverty in terms of the isolation and the ostracization of prisoners and stuff like that. And I think that practices of visiting the poor and helping the poor and visiting prisoners are practices that we had for a long time and that for some reason many of us, myself included, have given them up. And I wish we didn't.
Sarah Midzolkowski, class of 2004. By God's design, certainly not by mine, I've spent all my 10 years of ministry doing campus ministry. And so I've worked with a very different demographic of people than most folks doing parish ministry have. And I see in them a yearning to be plugged into the successful program. But I hear clearly questions from them about why they should plug into the church program rather than plug into the hundreds of NGOs, the hundreds of nonprofits that are out there that have burst upon the scene in the last 40, 50 years. It used to be the church was the social network, Now it's all these secular organizations. We joke that we don't want to become the United Way at Prayer. Hell, we should be so lucky to be the United Way at Prayer. We're not that good. We're not that organized. If they want to go to a good organized group to go and do that, then I'm going to tell them to go to the United Way. What we've lost in the middle of it, and what I hear questioned all the time is, well, what do you believe? Not what do you do? And that's where I think we've gone wrong, because I can't tell them to sign up to their local blah-de-blah church to go do good, because they're going to do it more effectively out in the other marketplace. I want to tell them to plug into church X, Y, and Z because they love Jesus there, and because they're going to have a relationship with others who love and show Jesus every day. And that's what they want. They want to know how we're different and how we actually relate to Jesus Christ. And I'm hoping we can deliver.
Yeah, I totally agree, and this is why I'm trying to recast the social gospel as only one facet of this larger practice of spiritual discipline, of trying not to surrender the treasure of the gospel in this way for a mess of pottage, but rather to see this as something that can be written back into a larger story of the church's training through and the encounter with Jesus into something of the spiritual kingdom of God. No, I believe very deeply that sense of what can the church do that like UNICEF or World Vision cannot? Like very little. We're lousy compared to these people. These are very, very efficient workers. We don't even do as well at bringing people regularly into our buildings as typical yoga studios do. Right? Your typical yoga studio has more take back in terms of, I mean, maybe we should just offer discounts like they do or something. They actually pay for yoga. But I do think that core idea that there is something of actually meaning and adventure and risk, and maybe this is where I've been touched by the young people too, that if you don't have that, you don't have anything.
While you were speaking, I kept having this image in my little parish that I serve in West Virginia, that all of my congregation is very comfortable worshiping together, but at coffee hour, forget it. The wealthy go home, the middle class come and share fellowship. Yeah. It's a very, it's a interesting phenomenon to me. So my question really comes from the fact that I'm sort of larking back to Ian's first question, and that is, as a priest, I'm getting more and more uncomfortable with the fact that I'm beholden to some of those wealthy people to keep my doors open to continue ministry in my parish. Right. And so I walk such a fine line, because if I take them on too much of a harrowing ride, I'm losing them. That's right. So I need sustenance. I so need to hear your information. But what I really need to hear is what to do.
Yeah. I have very little guidance for you here. I struggle with the question of how to keep students in my classes. So I think that's my only proximate answer. I think the only answer I actually would stand behind is that a lot of people who give money, I imagine, give money because they think it's the easy or natural thing to do, but how much are they being engaged in what's going on? Maybe there's another way of reaching out to them in some way. But again, I mean, this is a pastoral question in the deepest sense, which goes back to why at 21 it was very clear to me that I did not have any vocation to be a priest.
Jim Lewis, class of 1964. I just came from the Greenbrier over in the valley. All the executives from every single tobacco company were there. And they were there in the shadow of young people, 12 and 13 years old, working in those fields. Very dangerous work for lots of reasons. I came into this ministry in 1964 with migrant workers in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. Some of the same problems that were there then are there now. Laws haven't taken care of it, doesn't surprise me. But the question I have about this, and I'm looking for observations from your vantage point, is that we're looking for this social contract, more than just a law that doesn't get enforced, a social contract of some kind that may involve labor. And I want to hear a little bit more from you about labor. I was there with someone from the AFL-CIO, and I was there with Valdemar Velasquez, who's been organizing workers. He's done that since he was 6 years old, working in the fields himself. And it seems to me one of the only answers here, at least an avenue, is through organizing people, through organized labor. But this seminary did not give me much training in that. And our congregations don't.
Yeah.
Just be sure you brought all of it around in 1964, so...
I'm pretty sure with that plum accent, too, you would do a really good job of labor organizing. Hello, chaps. Right over here.
Just about of my seminary for very fine education. It didn't at all prepare me for what I had to see in the fields and with workers all over this country. So I'm saying it this way to you. How do we as a church, clergy, I hear these clergy and students, raise these difficult issues? In other words, just to ask someone from organized labor to come in and be a part and lead people out to where the workers are is a threat to every clergy, a lot of clergy people in these communities. How to break through that kind of fear. And I like, with organizing going on now around low-income workers and
Unite here and stuff.
And minimum wage, and we're seeing I think some good things happening here. What do you see, organized labor and religion, and particularly Episcopal Church in that? Some observations.
Thank you very much.
Very quickly, there's a wonderful book, slightly less painful than normally his other books are, by Jeffrey Stout, called Blessed Are the Organized, which is a wonderful book about his encounters with Ernie Cortez in the IAF and the Southwest organizing groups. It seems to me that organization in general is a wonderful thing to have. And by and large, the more you can actually have communication across groups, the better. That's my most immediate tactical advice. On a second order level, you said you did not receive a kind of training in this at the seminary. It might be nice to think about, as seminary education gets reformed, thinking about different ways and an ongoing career forming structure of education so that people can come back at different times, even for weekend workshops or stuff like that, where you can get training from various people of this sort. And we all know, the pieces are all there. We know Ernie Cortez, he'd be happy to fly over and chat with people or whatever. And one of the things I wanted to say here is that we need to teach our parishioners a sociological imagination. And I think actually that's a very important thing. We need to have our people in the pews have a vision of where they live and how it works the way it does. I've been in churches that have never actually, it's never been explained to me until I learned many years later how this church got to where it is and stuff like that. And that's a very interesting fact, like, what churches did what and stuff like that. Some of the churches in Charlottesville used to have schools in their basements, right? That was during massive resistance. And so these sorts of things are hidden from us in certain ways, and it would be a useful thing for us to know about those things. So organize and connect. Connect with our past, connect with each other. That's what I would say.
White schools or integrated schools in their basements?
Oh, they were white schools. Oh, of course. We were decent, right-thinking Episcopalians. What do you...
Bob Pritchard, a member of the faculty in church history, and I have a historical question about the earlier failures of the social action of social gospel in the beginning of the 20th century. One of the critiques that's often made is that those who preached the social gospel did a good job of touching the hearts of some of the rich, but had absolutely no success at all in a part of their vision, which was to preach a gospel that touched the lives of those who were the working poor. So the one great example in the Episcopal Church was W.P.D. Bliss in Boston, and other gathered other people together. They created the Church of the Carpenter, which was going to be the workers' church in Boston, and nobody showed up. In looking back, many people have said, if you look at who was successful among the poor in the late 19th century, it was people who preached a prosperity gospel.
Oh, yeah.
It was people who organized churches around ethnic communities, particularly for new immigrants, so they found something familiar. And those who preached a Pentecostal message that promised a spiritual power to people who had no economic or social power. So my question is, I've listened to a very good message and analysis. Do you have any insight into how a social gospel might empower the powerless as well as those who might be the guilty?
Yeah. So there's a famous line by, it's apocryphal, like they've been able to track it down, but purportedly by a Roman Catholic bishop in South America, putatively Chile, who said in the 80s or 90s, the church chose the poor, but the poor chose the Pentecostals. And I think that there has been a number of good studies of what the Pentecostals do, both in terms of their ideology and in terms of the material practices that they enable. One thing that you'll find in many more evangelical and Pentecostal churches, especially in the Global South, is a willingness to share wealth and a disciplining of errant masculinity. So you get many more reliable men in these churches than you do in the story is, the sociological story is, than you do in the traditional churches, Christian churches in these areas, because the ideology is such that you have disciplined the men. And the disciplined men then bring home more of a paycheck, and so this actually creates a kind of spiral of wealth, right? This is stuff by Peter Berger and some of his people out of this. I think that along with just calling our attention to the facts on the ground of our society, if you were to walk away thinking, are there other structures that I can do, or I can find out ways to help the neighborhood in which my church is placed or whatever, that would probably be a very useful thing. I suspect most of that is going to be a matter of learning from people who are already doing this work, not listening to humanities academics like me. That would be my most immediate advice. There are people, by and large, in almost every city in America, there are people who know at least where some of the need is. And if you can direct that, your aid to that need, then that will at least begin some help.
This is a question for you, Ian. This is more than I could take in. Are you going to make this available in print for us?
Just to reassure you, yes. It's our normal practice. Of course, we've not actually made the arrangement yet with the speaker, and he might have a whole host of interest in where it appears. But yes, we do our utmost. And it is being recorded and will be available, I'm searching around, webcast later on, so you can watch it all over again this evening. Yes, please.
Unlike my children, if you want to hear more from me, that's great.
Jim Smith, class of 62. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves who this Jesus is we want people to love. Soren Kierkegaard reminded us more than a century and a half ago that it's very, very difficult to proclaim Christianity within Christendom because we have so secularized it. Christianity at its root was countercultural, and if we are not uncomfortable, we're not doing the job.
I think that one important thing about what I was saying, about one thing I'd like to have you take away, I don't know if it's important, is the thought that in a way the social gospel really does signal the first recognition inside the church that Christendom is coming to an end, and that the church has to take on more responsibilities that it had previously assumed that other parts of the culture were going to inhabit. And I think that that's a process that's still underway. And there are large parts of our churches today that assume that other parts of the culture are going to support the gospel. And I'm not sure that they are. I don't think that universities are going to do this. I'm pretty damn sure the economic system we live in and that profits us, some of us very well, are going to do this. So the media is not. So I think there are lots of ways in which we have to learn to take back the practice of moral formation. One statistic on this that's just astonishing. By the age of 5, I believe, your typical American child knows the names of more than 200 brands. McDonald's, Kmart, all these brands, right? By the age of 5, this is a very biased audience. How many of your parishioners know more than 20 books of the Bible? How many 5-year-olds know all 50 states, but they know 200 brands? Right? Yeah. The advertising is right now the second largest industry in the world after either oil or weapons, depending on how you count them. And advertising wasn't an industry a century ago. So think about that. For the last century, we've undertaken the largest social experiment on shaping character that the human race has ever done. Right? So advertising is an interesting fact. You should have another seminar on advertising and bring in some advertising.
Andrew, please. Yes.
I want to thank you for that profound presentation that touched so many issues that we all need to be paying attention to. But I want to take us back to your statement that some of us are probably dumb or unlucky to not fully participate in the wealth, if I have that correctly. I want to talk a little bit more about the tragedy of some of the unlucky who are denied equal access to quality education, who are oppressed on a daily basis by social injustices, and especially our young children and young people that are pushed from the schoolroom to the prison system. And that is that is not recognized. As you mentioned before, mostly our people are blind to those kinds of injustices. And yet we see the rise in the popularity of the prosperity gospel. And I just wanted to ask you how you would line up one against the other, the social gospel and prosperity gospel.
You restated some of what I wanted to say, and so if something I said made you think I wasn't saying it, I apologize. When I was saying that line about dumb or unlucky, I meant that even in a perfect economic system where it was completely an even playing field from the beginning and everyone had the same opportunities, some lumpiness, some irregularities would emerge. Some people just through dumb luck would get rich. Some people through dumb luck would end up poor. Some people who were smarter, some people who were dumber. And those are natural, I mean, in some level, those are sometimes natural capacities, right? So I'm saying even in that situation, there can be poverty, right? The problem I have with that is that then if you install that poverty over generations and you say that because your parents were poor, therefore we're giving you less resources from the common good, which is by and large the way we do it now, that seems to me both a social injustice and a theological abomination. The question of the prosperity gospel, it seems to me, is a very interesting one, and it goes back to the earlier question about the history in this way. I think that there's a great new book by Kate Bowler called Blessed, which is on the kind of ideology of the prosperity movement, and she actually enters into the mindset of people in the movement and trying to make sense of how they're living out their lives. One thing I think she says, and says very powerfully, to me anyway, is that we joke about this, but the prosperity gospel actually tells people about meat and potato issues. And it doesn't leave it at a very abstract theological level. You know, you walk out of the church and you don't just think, well, Jesus loves me. You also think, Jesus loves me and he's going to help me get this vacuum cleaner this week. And so it seems to me that one of the things the prosperity gospel does is actually hook into some of the more mundane existential questions that people actually have. Maybe part of our problem is that so much of the time our theological message is so stratospheric, it can't actually hook up. It doesn't have the kind of traction on the everyday experience of people.
We've got time for one more question, and let's take two. But if you don't mind coming together, so one and then pass the mic across.
It's like a harmony.
That's right, so we'll take those, and this will...
I'm Linda Kaufman, class of 1986. And I spent 20 years doing works of mercy to help homeless people. And the last 5 years, really deciding that if I don't do justice, I'm not doing anything. And I wonder how we help the church to understand that we're beyond the time of soup kitchens and shelters, and that we really have to be about the business of changing all of what we've come to believe is acceptable work of the church.
Before you respond, Kathy, please.
And I just wanted to say, every time I go to the grocery store, the lines at the lottery machines are longer. I think part of what's happening with the prosperity gospel is that luck and the divine hand are being merged to the point where people are encouraged to believe what is a lie, that they have a chance of winning against an entirely stacked system, and that people are being encouraged to use money that could go somewhere else to. And as usual, the lottery's good for schools and good for other things, but it's hard on the poor.
Yeah. I agree. I agree with what both of you say. I don't know what to do to help us as a church gain in this knowledge of the situation, apart from trying to communicate stuff like this. I know that, and if I were the Episcopal Pope. It matters a lot that there are structures that we could use to have letters that might be read in churches or might be distributed in church bulletins or issues about statements and things like that. It would be easy with the intellectual resources, even in this room, to actually communicate to people in a very vital way something of the realities of the world that we live in now in a way that they're not getting. It seems to me, and I might be way off on this, and I feel like I wanted this paper and tomorrow's paper to be a step in that direction, but I feel like it needs to be a more intentional act on a lot of people's a lot of people's minds.
Ladies and gentlemen, the second lecture, as Dr. Mathewes alluded, is tomorrow, the second Zabriskie lecture. But for now, we've had a maestro, a tour de force, and a very provocative introduction to renewed social gospel. Let's thank